So does current 40k need a hard reset, and how likely might Games Workshop be to give it one? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k editions and focusing on the fairly interesting question as to how they might handle a new edition of Warhammer 40k, either refreshing the core rules or rebooting the game in its entirety. Judging by Games Workshop's past releases, they typically like to release a new editions of the game around every 3 years or so. Occasionally they have gone longer in the past, but recently they seem to have been amping up the release schedule far faster than they ever have done before, and it's pretty reasonable to assume that 10th edition might well be coming sometime in mid to late 2023. A few bits of rumours and speculation already seem to be flying around regarding that, but even if those are dismissed, it seems at least fairly likely that they'd be copying their fairly popular 8th edition and their launch of 9th edition, which sold them more boxes than it just about ever had before. When a new edition of the game comes out though, Games Workshop does have a pretty big decision to make, and one that's quite likely to have already been made as they'll be working on this new edition right now. The main question when they update the 40k rules is that whether or not they'll do a full reset of every set of rules in the game, including all the codexes and expansions, or just do a core rules update, change up the core book, the missions, and maybe a few of the other special rules, and leave the vast majority of codexes standing, but likely to be used in a fairly different form with the new rules for the game. So far, the core rules update seems to have been the way that they've mainly gone throughout editions of 40k. I think that they did a full reset in 7th edition and 4th edition, and of course in recent history in 8th edition, where they removed all the previous bloat that had built up in 7th. 8th edition really was quite a major shake-up, invalidating all the previous codexes and expansions and the layered special rules that had built up over the years, issuing a new and really quite different rulebook, and they printed relatively inexpensive faction indexes, simple rules to make all the armies functional at the start of the game, and came out with each faction's codexes pretty rapidly in succession after that, with a full revamp of most of the codexes being done around the 18-month mark after the edition launched. The alternative to that is doing something like a core rules update, like what they did with 9th edition, and also most of the editions before that. Everything from 5th to 7th edition just messed around with the core rules of the game and didn't go culling the codexes en masse, just updated them slowly in a drip feed release. During those updates, quite a lot of the slightly lesser played factions didn't even receive new codexes during the entire course of an edition of 40k. In those previous editions, I always felt that the changes felt a bit arbitrary. They made some things in some codexes better and some things worse, and often they didn't really help with any sort of game balance, often in some cases doubling down on buffing things that were already strong. In 9th edition, I think they handled it at least a little bit better on paper, as they wound up changing all the points costs in 9th edition at the same time, so at least in theory they made an effort to balance some of the things that were either going to be stronger or weaker in the new edition. Throughout 9th edition, the codex rollout has perhaps been a little bit slower, I'm sure in no small part due to the whole pandemic situation, maybe partly due to their whole season type approach as well, and making individual campaign content throughout the edition as well, with those Warzone supplements. Just for interest, I made a channel poll to see whether or not people would prefer for a full reset of the game or just a core rules update, and in general mainly people opted for a full index style reset as opposed to just messing around with the core rules. It was interesting to see people's reasons for that, though I must admit I think a fair few people were maybe a little bit confused as to what they were asking for, as a lot of the reasons that people gave for a full rules reset could perhaps be quite easily handled just by editing the core rules and points costs, as opposed to getting rid of all the codexes en masse in a big go. In any case, I thought we could talk through a few of the positives of both the approaches. First up, if Games Workshop did decide to do what they did in 9th edition, and usually what they normally do, then doing a core rules update does have a few things that they could get better. While 9th edition codex balance has been a massive rollercoaster of a ride, I think few people would argue that each of the factions is really quite supported with in-depth rules at the moment. Whether you're a narrative or a competitive gamer, you can have rules representing, say, Valhalla Imperial Guardsmen or Iyanden Eldar, and interesting and special options and traits for things like Death Guard Plague Companies or different Tau Septs. I think that the 9th edition codexes really have offered a lot of flavour, say things like Fond Demon Blessings for Chaos Knights, or perhaps Death Guard Contagions of Nurgle making enemies easier to kill when they're in close range. Plus there's Crusade rules for just about every army, and I think that actually between the codexes, balance aside, most armies do actually have a similar level of content to each other. Almost every faction has multiple different layers of special rules that they can put on their miniatures, between character buffs, sub-faction traits and army-wide special rules. Plus, at least in terms of game balance, in this Warzone Nephilim that we're in at the moment, I do feel that things are a bit more balanced than they've been in a long time. Codex creep has been a massive problem for 9th edition, but Games Workshop do seem to be getting it under control now that most of them are out. Perhaps another reason that just making minor tweaks to the core rules might be better is that I would argue that most of the core rules of 9th edition are actually quite good. The new approach of 8th edition wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but it did draw really quite a lot of people back to the game, and I'd largely seen 9th edition as basically trying to iron out as many of the flaws and complaints that people had with 8th edition. They've acquired a whole bunch of special rules to make armies look a bit more like armies, say for example the rule of 3, the incentives to field detachments and not take too many, forcing people back into the force organisation chart a bit more, ways that you can field allies within factions, but it makes more sense to field pure armies that look a bit more thematic. Both ranged and melee armies are actually pretty viable in game right now, which certainly hasn't been the case for quite a while in 40k. And terrain and the battlefield are a fair bit more meaningful than they were in 8th edition, when a lot of terrain would basically just equate to being a bit of a shooting gallery and still hoovering enemy forces off the board. All of those tweaks and adjustments do come with a fair bit of bloat, but I think most of the things that Games Workshop changed have usually been changes for the better, and it does feel like a much more refined edition than the more experimental 8th edition that we had. Starting from scratch again could throw up its own new problems. Another reason for not chucking out all the codexes is that generally people do get annoyed if Games Workshop invalidates their own publications. Codexes and expansion books and things do cost a fair bit of money from Games Workshop. We're now in the era of $50 or £30 codexes. They're fairly big investments just for rulebooks, and people don't like seeing all that money suddenly be turned into basically waste paper with pretty pictures. I think it'd be pretty galling for the last factions to be released in the edition, things like Guard, Chaos Marines and Demons, who have waited literally years for their codex to come out. If they did suddenly call them all in a edition refresh next year, then I can't imagine those players being happy, having not had much time to play with their armies as it was intended in 9th edition. Finally, I would say that quite a lot of the criticisms that people level at 9th edition mean that they don't really need a hard reset to actually fix them. A lot of the comments that I was seeing in that poll were basically saying, I really don't like this, they should just reset the whole thing. Say maybe two of the most major complaints are that stratagems and codexes are really quite bloated and they should tone them down. And a lot of people have been somewhat critical of the secondary objectives and things in 40k missions and how they take a bit more faff and organising than previous versions of the game. The thing is, I think for those mechanics they don't really need an entire hard reset to fix those. If Games Workshop just decided that they're going to remove stratagems from the game, they could have a 10th rulebook basically saying that stratagems no longer apply, and to basically ignore the relevant sections of those respective codexes. Maybe a bit more likely is some sort of limitation on them, say you have to choose 3 or 4 stratagems to be included in your army, and it's another part of list building, but one that's kind of manageable for your opponent to understand, rather than expecting them to remember 30 plus stratagems. Potentially pretty easy fixes that you don't necessarily have to take all the codexes down for, and a core rules update could implement that just fine. So while I do think that there's really quite a lot of positives of not just deleting all the codexes in the game, there's still quite a lot of interest and excitement if they did reissue everything, as is pretty obvious by that poll. I'd say perhaps the single most valid reason to take everything down and start again from scratch is to remove the fairly hefty amount of rules bloat that 9th edition has acquired. While all the refinements and all the depth in the codexes has made 9th edition really quite interesting, and it does realise a lot of things on the table that are generally good things, it does mean it's fairly horrendously complex for new players to approach. Understanding the core mechanics of the game is one thing, but then in each codex there's about 7 or 8 different layers of extra rule sections that you might want to grasp, plus any of the complexities and the slight differences between the different mission packs and things. And I think approaching the whole of 40k in general just isn't all that easy at the moment. I think the two things are kind of directly in conflict. You're always going to have to strike a balance between in-depth, bespoke rules for different armies and making the game simple to play. And I would say that people asking for both of them in equal measure are kind of being a bit unrealistic. The one will usually come at the expense of the other. I must admit though, it is a bit intimidating when even just basic models like a standard Space Marine could be operating under the effects of something like 7 plus special rules all at the same time. Just off the top of my head, they'd have Shock Assault, Bolter Discipline, and They Shall Know No Fear, Objective Secured, Chapter Tactics with multiple different parts, Combat Doctrines, and maybe their Chapter's Super Doctrine, never mind any benefits that they might get from nearby special characters, and stratagems that you could have the power to use on the unit. Maybe it's just a bit concerning when you could spend 5 minutes talking through how a basic Space Marine works. Even with that little lot, I managed to forget Armour of Contempt as well, and I'm sure I forgot some more as well. I think you maybe don't have to think too hard to think of some of the more bad examples of rules bloat in 9th edition. Say for example the recently previewed demon saves, basically invulnerable saves that are immune to the ability of ignoring invulnerable saves. Certainly feels like a bit of power creep one-upmanship there. There's a fair few really high-ranking characters in the game that can only take something like 3 or 4 wounds per phase, and then there's some weapons that can ignore that, like that demon weapon from the new Chaos Codex. Stratagems in general are a usual source of ire. You can't expect most players to remember something like 30 plus stratagems for an army that they don't play, particularly when there's over 20 factions in the game. It makes gotcha moments a bit easy, even if players do try and talk through notable things before the game happens. On the power creep scale, a lot of people aren't too happy that AP creep has been met with changes like Armour of Contempt. Again, that definitely feels like some one-upmanship. I would argue that maybe it's not the worst idea, as it gets around some of the limitations of having dice with only 6 sides. That could be a whole discussion topic in itself, I guess. And otherwise, just how the rules are delivered can be a bit unhelpful. At least most of the 9th edition content tends to fall within the Codex. The extra supplemental things can be ignored if desired, but you still might need something like 3 different digital documents like the balanced data slate, the faction's FAQ, and the latest points update if you do actually want to play in the army. Finally, maybe a few universal special rules might not be the worst idea, seeing as we essentially already have them and they just function with all sorts of different names. Feel no pain type saves are one, as is -1 damage, flyer rules, and plenty of other abilities. I think a lot of people might be wound up by 1 or 2 of the individual things of these, but not too bothered about the rest. I think in general, though, people just get annoyed at 1 or more of them because there's just so much going on. And maybe the main problem is more that there's just too much bloat, as opposed to any one thing being truly bad. Otherwise, I do feel that the general sentiment of 9th edition has been a bit more mixed reception than 8th perhaps. A lot of people really do love the rules, I'd say that the competitive game in particular is in quite a good state at the moment, but a lot of people are just a bit less engaged with all the rules bloat and the power creep that has been going on throughout the edition. And maybe people who aren't quite as engaged with it are just a lot more happy to say just delete entirely and try something new altogether. Finally, regardless of whether or not it's necessarily better for game balance or things, I must confess that I think most people would find an entire reboot of the game at least quite a fun thing. Not only are you getting an entire new rule system for 40k to explore, but every single army gets different rules. A lot of things might be better or worse, and the entire process of just finding out what's worst or how your army is going to react in the game is quite a fun one. I must admit I did enjoy Indexed 8th edition for all its major flaws. I guess that was coming from 7th edition though, which was its own version of bloated mess, and perhaps arguably even more unbalanced than 9th edition has ever been. The other really common pipe dream that people have had for an edition reset would be an impossible third option, basically where Games Workshop redoes an entire edition and then releases all the factions' codexes all at once, rather than drip-fed over the previous few years. It's often requested, but in reality Games Workshop just aren't ever realistically going to do this, as it just doesn't make sense for them on a number of different reasons. Redoing every single codex is a pretty staggering amount of effort, and in general when people make content for something they don't typically drop it all in one go. It almost always makes much more sense to release it slowly over the course of a period of time, as it keeps people engaged and stops people being overwhelmed, as realistically getting to grips with a new codex and putting together an army is quite a big process. You're not going to be able to do too many of those at once. On the other hand though, if they do stagger them out, people might say get their Space Marines together when they release the codex at the start of the edition, and then be looking forward to say when they release the Orcs codex so they can get their Orc army back up to shape and have that to look forward to later in the edition. At least that could be the theory. Maybe sometime along the way when they get bored waiting for the new codex to come out, they might get tempted by one of the other armies. I'm sure it all works out very nicely for Games Workshop. Just for interest in 40k as well, I think it's also the right move for them for that. If you just release all the content that you've developed for the next 3 years all in one big go, you're going to have loads of people interested and experimenting at the start, but then people are genuinely going to start losing interest and move on to other things, maybe other game systems or other producers, just because 40k is not going to be seeing any major changes for the next year or so. There's a bit of a danger of it becoming a bit of a solved puzzle maybe. Don't get me wrong though, I think it could potentially make game balance a fair bit better. You wouldn't have the problem of codex creep and armies with a codex outcompeting the ones that don't. I'd imagine that game balance might not be amazing at the start, even if all the codexes were written in tandem, but then after they've done a balance pass and nerfed some of the strongest stuff and buffed some of the weakest, you might get a lot more of a balanced game of 40k going onwards. I think that's perhaps the reason that people are so keen for this sort of thing, but I genuinely think that Games Workshop aren't going to do it, as you probably would have fewer people playing 40k as a result once the initial enthusiasm dies down. and I don't think that they'd be quite as successful trying to add interest through new competitive seasons, balance passes, or campaigns. It just doesn't have the same sort of appeal as your army getting a book updated. I'll certainly be interested to hear your takes on this, and whether you prefer 10th edition to be a hard reset or a core rules update, but I think it's pretty interesting to speculate on what's likely to happen based on the rumours and leaks that we have so far. My guess would be that it's more likely that Games Workshop might have a core rules update rather than a full hard reset, though I think either of them would be really quite interesting. From the rumours that we've got so far, supposedly a new Space Marine book will be out before 10th edition, sometime in early 2023, and we've got some other codexes that are going to be very shortly on the horizon, things like Leagues of Votan, World Eaters, and more. Often with Warhammer editions, Games Workshop seems to like basing them around Space Marine codexes, and I think it would be kind of unlikely for them to release a new edition without a Space Marine codex at least fairly early in it, and I just feel that if they do wind up releasing the next codex before 10th edition, I think they'd be unlikely to invalidate it within something like 6 months if these rumoured timescales do pan out. In the past, I think they have invalidated them within something like 1 year, but I think that making an update before consigning it to the waste paper basket within 6 months or so will be surprising even for them. I kind of feel if they are likely to do a rug pull for everyone who bought codexes, then they might be a bit more likely to do something like a fairly slow campaign series, maybe something like the Gathering Storm before 8th edition came out. Campaign books that are supposed to be about as much about entertainment rather than lasting rules, and allow them to make some sort of content and keep the interesting lore coming, without actually doing any sort of major releases too close to when a new edition comes about. That's just based on some of the rumours that we've had so far, but it certainly doesn't mean that they can't change things up this time if they wanted to. I just can't imagine Space Marine players being too happy if they did get a new update on a codex, and then Games Workshop just invalidates it very, very quickly. Maybe if we see some sort of standalone campaign series like the Gathering Storm, it might make a big hard reset just that little bit more likely perhaps. So anyway, let me know what you think down in the comments. If Games Workshop does indeed release 10th edition next year, would you prefer a hard reset or a core rules update, and why? We've still got plenty of 9th edition to come before that, I'm sure, though I still think it's interesting to speculate. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does also have a Patreon page as well, and you can check that out down in the video description if you're interested. It is what allows me to keep on making all this 40k content quite so regularly. If you are enjoying a lot, channel patrons do get a few benefits, seeing some videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.